All right, we're kicking off the stream. We're going to give it a few seconds there to kick in, and then we'll get started. How you guys doing today? Awesome.
Good.
All right, well, welcome everyone to today's Kubernetes office hours, where we answer your user questions live on the air with our esteemed panel of experts here. You can find us in #office-hours on Slack, and check the topic of the URL. That should take you to a document in GitHub that has all the live stream information and our times and things like that. This is our Western edition. We had a session earlier in the day today for the European folks. So before we begin, let's get started by introducing ourselves. I'm going to be your host today. I'm George Castro. And let's begin with our panel. Please introduce yourselves, where you work, what you work on. That'd be really great.
Hey everyone, I'm Mario Loria. I am based in Ann Arbor, a mile away from George, actually. And I am working for LiquidWeb, a leader in hosting web properties for small and medium-sized businesses. And we are embarking on Kubernetes, and that's what I work on. So I also run a local meetup group called Orchestructure, which George helps with. So that's my story. Next.
Josh, I believe you're next.
Okay. Hi, I'm Josh Burkus. I'm a community manager for Kubernetes for Red Hat. I also spend a lot of time fiddling around with running databases on Kubernetes, which is my real passion and interest in orchestration. And I live in Portland, Oregon, where I make pottery and blacksmith.
That's awesome. One thing he left out is he's very involved in Postgres, and if you're running Postgres on Linux at some point, you're touching something that Josh has touched and been intimate with. So, Chris, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Dockery. I work with George at Heptio. I'm a support engineer and just focus on supporting all things Kubernetes.
Sweet.
All right. And I am Frank Greco. I work at Northwestern Mutual, which is based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I do a lot of work with Kubernetes here. I also do a lot of work with implementing controllers for Kubernetes custom resource definitions. And I've implemented a Canali API gateway, or API gateway called Canali, open source project. But hi.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, before we start, we're going to set a few ground rules for everybody here. So first off, this is a judgment-free zone, so everyone had to start from somewhere. So please help us out by being supportive in the channel and things like that. Let's not make any judgments of people's mistakes, or if they're doing something wrong. Let's just try to keep it positive and pay it forward. While we do our best to answer your questions, the panel actually doesn't have SSH access to your cluster. So live debugging, doing like really complex things is kind of off topic. So what we'll do our best is to get you kind of moving down a path to help you understand the things that you need debug, and hopefully help you kick the can down the road, as it were. Panelists, you're encouraged to expand on your answers with your experience and pro tips as well. So if it's a quick answer about a certain topic and you have some expertise in that area, let's expand it a little bit so that we're not just churning through subjects. Let's actually teach people our expertise and best practices. Audience, you guys can help us out by pasting in URLs to the official docs, blogs, or anything that might help, any research while we're discussing these topics. If you find yourself Googling, please paste those URLs in there. What we like to do is collect them all and put them in the show description so that those resources are available to people later. You can also help us out by tweeting, spreading the word, telling your coworkers about us, telling your friends, telling people at meetups, so that we can make this show be as useful for everyone as possible. We record each and every session, and it's available on YouTube. If you're using this resource, please just do let us know how we can get better, because we're also always constantly tweaking something. If there's a problem with the stream, or there's a technical issue, just let us know on Slack. Like, for example, right now we're streaming that this is the EU edition, where it's actually the Western edition. I'll fix that after this. So yeah, feel free to go watch the old archives and stuff like that. There's lots of good information there. If you want to sit in on this panel and spread your knowledge, you're more than welcome, and you can earn this fabulous water bottle by helping us help users. So You can help us take notes at the URL that we've pasted in the channel. If you want to, feel free and paste URLs in there. Or, excuse me, I'm getting over the flu. Or if we find a bug or something that we need to ping someone or a developer or something, please let us know. We're always looking for marketing help. So if you're good at social media, like while we're doing the show, it's really difficult for us to tweet and do things like that. So if you want to help us out in that matter, you're more than welcome. It's a great way to earn one of the water bottles. Soon we'll be holding raffles for the audience. So we'll be giving away shirts, Kubernetes spinner, if you can hold that up again, Mario, that'd be great. And all sorts of cool stuff. So what we'll do is if you participate, if you ask a question, if you help somebody out, we'll have a raffle at the end and give somebody a, and then we'll pick a winner and then we'll give you a code to the CNCF store and you get some swag. It's pretty cool. But not the water bottle. You have to sit in this panel for a while to earn this guy. And lastly, feel free to hang out and hash office-hours afterwards. I know a lot of the channels have a lot of people. They're full. Sometimes it's hard to get an answer. So if you're finding value here and you're looking for a place to kind of hang out, pull up a chair and try to help us make this a really fun and collaborative place to do. And with that, we are ready to get started. What do you guys say we start this show? So 1 second. Feels like, yep. 1 second. I lost desktop audio. How's the stream? If someone can, is the audio still coming through? Stream is rocking. Okay. All right. Let's start with our first question, which comes from a Whippler. But 1 second, Mario or one of the panelists, can you guys talk real quick? I just want to make sure that.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, perfect. And they sound good, stream? All right, here we go. All right, is there a good introduction to all the networking requirements for Kubernetes, such as where Kubernetes gets its pod, node, etc. IPs? I set up a cluster with Cryo and Flannel. My nodes can pull down images, but my pods cannot route to the outside world. And he goes on to say, the pods can't ping 8.8.8. They can ping each other. So what do we think about this? Where's a good place to start?
Yeah, well, I've been looking into cases where people have had similar problems, also spinning up a Kubernetes cluster in the background. And usually this has to do with your network overlay config. But in this particular case, he's also using Cryo, which is relatively new. So I was also going to ping one of the Cryo developers to see if there was anything special that needed to be done for network setup there.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the Cryo team is all European, so far I've not seen a response to my ping since it's pretty late over there.
Okay, and we can always come back to that and add notes and get a hold of you and link people together. How about anybody else? Any ideas where you could get started?
I mean, one thing I always do is just check my security groups and firewalls and make sure there's nothing being blocked there. But that's more outside of the scope of a cluster. I'm more just.
Yeah, can I ask if is it bare metal? Is it a bare metal cluster or a cloud?
Feel free to go ahead and just type in the channel, and then if there's too much of a delay, we can go to other questions and bounce back and forth. This is a bare metal cluster, as you probably suspected. So I was going to say, usually when I run into people having problems with bare metal clusters and networking, it's an on-site issue, like they're doing it at work. They have egress filtering or something like that.
Yeah, but he says you can actually reach the external internet from the nodes, just not from inside the pods.
Source IP check, maybe?
Yeah. Mateo adds, it would help to get routing table dump with route-rn. So while let's let that conversation kick off for a little bit while we move on, and then we'll circle back around to it. Jim Angel asks, I'm seeking advice for limiting user/RBAC for dev team deployments in the enterprise/production. What are the best practices for user/application segmentation?
So first, I would say split your environments in different clusters. So don't have prod in the same cluster as you have your non-prod environments. But specifically with RBAC, so by default, Kubernetes will inject a service account token into your pod, and without any RBAC, that will have, they used to have access to everything. I believe in newer versions of Kubernetes, they limit that. But that's still not, from a deployment perspective, that's still not going to stop developers from, for example, in their deployment spec, mounting secrets that maybe they shouldn't mount. Because it's not actually that pod that's doing the mounting, the kubelet that's doing the mounting. And so you would have to use something like admission controllers to actually limit stuff like that. RBAC would be more useful if you want to limit maybe a developer's kubectl access, or if your app is actually reaching out to the Kubernetes API, limit the access that that app would have, that app code would have when communicating with the Kubernetes API. So I think when people talk about limiting access, especially for deployments, I think that admission controllers are maybe more suited for the needs than RBAC, unless you're specifically talking about kubectl.
Mm-hmm. He goes on to say, more specifically, I'm looking to leverage Kubernetes in the enterprise and only have experience being the sole operator. What's the best practice to allow a dev team limited access to deploy pod/write without giving them the keys to the entire castle?
Yeah, so we're actually going through this right now,
Sorry.
Rachel, and we're actually starting to implement admission controllers because it can be very dangerous to just have a CI pipeline where you allow developers to create their Kubernetes.yaml file and just apply it, right? Because they can run their pod with security context equal true, or they can use the host network, or if they're a daemon set, they can use a host port. It's stuff that you may not want developers to do, especially in a large enterprise or small enterprise. And so an admission controller, if you're not familiar, what it will do is well, there's a couple of them. The one that I like to use is what's called a validating webhook configuration. This is fairly new. It's in 1.9, and it basically allows the API server to call out to a service, and you can basically write a rules engine, and Kubernetes will send you the spec that's being applied, and then based on the rules that your specific security team or enterprise has, you can determine whether that spec can or can't be applied based on the specific rules and the access that you want to give developers. And so I would definitely look into that.
Mm-hmm. Any other opinions?
I was basically going to kind of add to that. Right now, what we do for our internal stuff is have a really fancy bash script that just adds people to the cluster admin role, which is something you don't want to do. Do not do that. That is a quick way to cause problems. You're effectively giving everyone root in the cluster. So definitely don't do that. Admission controllers are quite nice. We're looking into them right now. And RBAC can get a little bit hairy. I think RBAC is really more reserved for the applications running, the workloads running in your cluster, right? Things like your ingress controller and cert manager, et cetera. So yeah, definitely admission controllers.
Do you guys know if Kubernetes changed the default service account token that's mounted in the container as far as the access it has?
I don't think so. I think it's still just full access. I could be wrong.
Because the one thing I would do is, like, even if you use admission controllers, definitely create like a global RBAC policy that denies access, or maybe just has read only, because nothing stops some malicious application code from calling the Kubernetes API and deleting all resources.
Yep, that's exactly true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And similar to the namespaces question we had this morning, I also think there's like a separation of concerns things here. So one of the things I got out of Kelsey Hightower's keynote this year, he was like, don't fall down the RBAC rabbit hole where you find yourself making really complex policies, right? Just put things in this cluster and put things in that cluster and keep it simple organizationally, right?
Yeah, so separation here is a huge thing. So I know when I started using AWS way back when, people were like, well, just make separate AWS accounts entirely. And maybe you don't have to do that. Maybe you do completely separate areas and VPCs and whatnot, but those methods should kind of carry over to Kubernetes, and that isolation and separation, take the time to do it and get it ironed out, and then you worry less, and life is easier overall. So.
Mm-hmm. All right. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, please Please feel free to post follow-up. Also, everyone else, please feel free to start dumping your questions in #office-hours, and we'll get to them as we get to them. We will also, if you see someone struggling on Kubernetes users and want to point them this way, that would also really help us out. Let's see. So let's catch up on the channel here. Tim Pepper would like to point out egress policy documentations. Someone sharing their flannel config. Yo Mateo would like to remind everyone that RBAC does not equal an RBAC replacement at the application layer, plus or minus API gateways. Everyone appears to be nodding. Okay, good. A Whippler's back with some more information about his network. Unfortunately, he's not able to get a route dump. Bummer. But it looks like people are pointing him to similar bugs. So yeah, let's open it up for questions. While we're waiting for some questions, someone asked this morning, are there any common tools that you all use for debugging your clusters as far as, when things are busted? It kind of, we didn't want to turn it into a text editor comparison thing, but, if panel, if you want to share just some of the best practices or some great tools that you use to debug your clusters, that would help add to the to our corpus of information.
So when I'm debugging, a cluster, I guess not so much an application, but a cluster, like if I have a cluster issue, if the first thing I do is I'll spin up a BusyBox container in the cluster and then check networking, right? So if it's a networking thing, you want to see if Kubernetes DNS is working. DNS can have some side effects depending on what base image you're using for your Docker container. I think if you're using Alpine, you can't use you have to use the fully qualified Kubernetes DNS, even if you're within the same namespace. I believe that bug still exists. But definitely networking. Most issues I find are networking related.
I was just going to say, yeah, getting a container spun up, getting a pod spun up in the namespace or a cluster that I need to kind of do some troubleshooting in, and just getting an idea of what the environment looks like if I'm an application is super helpful. My go-to is usually the Fusion base image, and then I end up installing DNS utils and other things. I'm working on my own image as well, but just trying to use all of my resources. Also, kubectl is super powerful, much more than just a basic get things, edit things, etc. Like you can do a lot with expressions and narrowing down your searches and whatnot. So there's a cheat sheet out there. Definitely use that. That is super helpful.
Yeah, and don't forget about the kubectl logs -- previous. So if you have a pod that crashes, you can get the logs of the previous pod that crashed most of the time. It doesn't work all the time, but by just doing kubectl logs -- previous and then the rest of your command.
That is a good one. I did not know that one. Chris, you have anything to add? Looks like Josh is busy helping somebody.
Oh yeah, I'd give a heavy plus sign to BusyBox, and just kind of echo what Frank said. Most of the issues we see are network related, and the more granular you can go in the beginning of your troubleshooting, the easier it'll be to root out the issue.
All right.
One thing I'll add real quick is, if you're a developer, and you have like a larger enterprise cluster, definitely like get it working in Minikube or something first before deploying out to a larger cluster, just to limit it, just to get rid of any application bugs right off the bat.
Sure. Okay, we've got a long one, so I'm gonna do my best to try to translate this. So Mark Fem, if I butcher any part of this, please point it out in the in the channel, and you guys can probably see this. I have a question about network policy, if that's okay. I'm on GKE using Calico. I've read quite a few different documents and example policy configs. However, I don't think the following has been covered in as much detail anywhere that I've found yet. In what order are policies applied in IP tables rules when it comes to Kubernetes network policy with Calico? Would, I guess, be part one of his multi-part question.
So are you saying if you have multiple Kubernetes network policy resources, you're wondering what order they are applied.
That's what it sounds like. Please confirm in the stream there. I'm in the history, so
Now,
what if you can monitor?
this is
his
very
response?
naive because I not an IP. I don't know. I'm not an expert with IP tables, but a lot of the network policy stuff works with label selectors, right? So like you can say ingress traffic to this pod can only come from pods that have these metadata labels on it.
Mhm.
Is that stuff stored in an IP tables command? Like will Calico create IP table rules based on that and then update them when the pod updates? Or does it actually enforce those via a controller that they implement? I haven't looked into the implementation details.
As far as I know, it's IP tables, and I believe Weave works very similar. I could be wrong on that, though.
Let me keep filling you guys in while you're thinking. Presumably, order is important, as IP table normally simply goes through a list one by one, finds the first match, then whatever that match is will result for that connection. Does either deny or allow have a higher priority over the other? Like if two rules existed and one was deny and the other was allow, which would take precedence? And similar again, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, so IP tables is all based on order, right? So there's a deny and allow, which one takes precedence, the one that's above it, right? So the basically a packet comes in and it's matched against a rule, and it's matched against all the rules, and then once it matches one, then that action is taken, right? And so it doesn't continue down the chain. And generally, with most Kubernetes things, you shouldn't be directly working with IP tables because you've got your Weave working on Weave and whatever, like for instance, Docker working in IP tables and putting rules in there and managing those for you generally.
Yeah.
So you generally don't want to manually intervene if you can help it. So continue.
Yeah, and he's using Calico, just as a reminder. Similar again, what's the order of precedence when you have multiple network policies in existence that might contain different rules but impact the same pod? So two different scenarios here. Two different network policies are configured to create rules for the same pod labels as another network policy already might have defined. Similar scenario, but a rule exists covering the whole namespace, such as block all ingress traffic to all pods. Then further rules exist that are more fine-grained because they relate to a pod selector selecting specific labels, which somehow trump the catch-all rule. Does that make sense? Sorry, that was a long one.
So someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think network policies are actually applied in alphabetical order in Kubernetes, which is kind of strange. It's a strange thing we've run into, but you can actually get a network policy to precede another by adding, say, 00 dash in front of it and numbering them that way. It's kind of a strange thing, but I'm pretty sure that applies here.
Yeah, but because it's IP tables and it's order-based, if you apply an allow all and a deny all at the same time, whichever one Kubernetes applies last at that instant would technically take precedence, right?
Yeah, that sounds correct.
That would be correct. So it's really based on how the action is executed, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say on this one, I think jumping in he's using Calico, like jumping into their support facilities and asking more questions about that. I sadly do not know Calico well enough as well. So
Calico does have its own Slack.
Okay.
Okay.
And they're pretty responsive.
Mark adds, that's exactly true on that order. However, there appears to be no way to define that one rule should be more important than another.
Chris was saying something with naming, so maybe you can say it's more important by having it higher in the alphabet.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark. Well, let us know how you get on, and then we can certainly close the loop on that. And there's also SIG networking. I'm pretty sure Calico smart folks attend that meeting. If someone can find the list of SIGs and paste it into the chat there, I'm sure someone at SIG Network could at least point you in the right direction. Okay, so I am going to go to the next Helm question, which is about Helm. If I am skipping your question or I haven't seen it because it's scrolling, please feel free to just highlight me, paste it back in, and then we'll get to it. Dermidjan asks questions. How into Helm are y'all? Is Helm a best practice yet? one level of complexity would one ditch individual resource configs to go with a chart. So we actually had a Helm person here a few weeks ago.
Yeah,
I don't know how Helmish you folks are.
So I'm a huge proponent of Helm. I've been using it literally days after I found Kubernetes because it makes life easier on so many levels. Let's see, his first question, how into Helm are you? I'm using it daily. I'm using it for production deployments, upgrades, rollbacks for workloads in our cluster, mainly core services. So things like Ingress controller, Cube Cert Manager, Portworx, whatever we're running that's a core service. We have it completely managed in Helm. We have our own repositories as well. It is stable. It's something that you can trust. You know what you're getting. The commands are straightforward. There's dry run functionality, etc. It's one of my favorite utilities ever, actually. Best practices, be very explicit with things. Take the time to invest in your values files, which define configuration for a particular template, right? So for your Ingress controller, you might have a few page values file. Make sure that is version controlled. Make sure that multiple people understand why certain options are set. Make sure you've got standards within your organization for how to handle changes and that process as well. It's not just I'm on my laptop and I need to apply something. It's also a CI/CD tool as well, primarily a CD tool. And that's where it actually has rollback and fantastic upgrade functionality that you can use as well. Let's see, at one level of complexity.
Wait, real quick before you move on, I have a corollary question. So okay. You're actually full on Helm. You're not just browsing and grabbing the public charts. Like all your internal stuff. You're doing your own charts in your own thing.
Yep. So,
like I don't know what they call their store, like repo.
No, it's Helm charts, and then what we actually do is we pull from upstream and we maintain our own charts because there's a lot of customizations we might have here and there for like maybe a service account is configured or something like that. That you can't get with just the values file with just basic configuration, right? So we do that because then we track them as well. So they're versioned. So a chart itself is versioned. So that templated config is its own version, right? As well as the application it might be deploying, right? So and the other thing with Helm is that it's actually meant to be a centralized catalog that you can. So Helm is meant to tap into a Helm server, if you will. That can find a chart and deploy it for you, right? So you don't have to do just a repository or just local files. You can actually have them hosted somewhere as well. So so we actually pull those down and maintain those. And we'll pull any updates from, so the Nginx Ingress control is a great example. There's fantastic updates going into that weekly, into that chart, optimizing it. A new image has been pushed, etc., right? So we'll go in and we'll pull those down as needed. That's kind of a very intro way of using it, right? So the other key thing is making sure that all of the people that are using Helm understand how to use it, right? So you don't want people stepping on each other's actions, and Helm makes that really easy to do. And then he asked just one more thing: level of complexity would one ditch individual resource configs and go with the chart. There's the initial level of understanding and a little bit of complexity there in understanding what a template actually is, the multiple pieces and how to apply it. But once you start using it, you'll realize how very powerful it is. The Helm community hangs out in #Helm users in the Kubernetes Slack. They're super supportive, and every issue that I've opened up for Helm has been closed as fixed or implemented. So I would definitely look into it and keep using it. I will be hanging out in office hours. I can answer more questions about it too.
Yeah, and there's a Helm summit in February. Is there not? Someone could Google that up and paste the URL for people in the channel. That'd be really great. Chris, you had some opinions on charts that you put in the channel.
Yeah, I'll paste the summit URL.
Right. Yeah, my biggest point is to not just trust charts from out in the wild willy-nilly without thoroughly vetting them and knowing exactly what they're going to do in your cluster when you deploy it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, there's the we always pull them. We start playing with them in dev, figuring out what resources they're going to push out. And there's the dry run flag and the debug flag, and so you can see exactly what Helm pushed to the cluster. And I think a lot of people. So for us, we had a lot of people that were deploying some sort of workload, and it had a service account, a RBAC role. And other assets that were just kind of placed around the cluster. And so I had to go back now and actually reverse engineer certain things and try to bring them together into a Helm chart, bring all of its assets together and make it easier to manage long term. So it's something that you should definitely look into.
Yeah, that brings up another point that Nick brings up in the channel. What's the TLDR and RBAC integration and stuff? I know for a while there, when RBAC landed, like I had to go shut stuff off to get Helm to work. Is that sorted?
So there is I believe there's a cluster role binding to set up Tiller to have access. However, you're going to want to figure out what's optimal for you, right? If you want Tiller to have full access to your cluster, then have fun with that. There's also TLS that you should enable as well. There's more that you can do. It's RBAC is enabled, and you really just kind of have to sit down and configure it based on what you want the power Helm should have over your cluster and deploying things, right? And you may say, I only want it to have deploy access to Cube system, but no kill access or something like that. That should be possible, right? So it's come quite a ways. It's well supported, and it's a pretty fantastic tool.
Yeah, okay. We have some follow-up questions as well, so we're gonna move on so we can get back to you here. Astam asks, how do I prevent a node from going down because the out-of-memory killer on a cluster that was brought up by Cops? Kubectl server version, he's running 184, clusters brought up on AWS. I've seen a node go a couple of times, which causes a domino effect because a cluster autoscaler does not react as fast, and fail pods are scheduled on other nodes, which later brings it down with the same problem. I already upgraded instances type to prevent that, so he vertically grew. However, since I want my application to be autoscale by HPA, it may happen in the future again. I'm looking for advice on how to prevent nodes from memory overcommitment, basically.
No, so he wants to figure out how to basically, or could you repeat that last part?
He's looking for advice on how to prevent a node from overcommitting on memory.
So, I mean, step one, I would say, or step zero is do proper capacity planning. That's something that a lot of people don't start with and mature into. The one thing I will say, and we've run into this, is if you use a horizontal pod autoscaler, if you do not, and this is important, if you do not define a resource on your pod, the HPA has no effect. It will be unknown / 100%. It won't actually know how much resource that pod is using. And so, yeah. But define resources on your pods, do proper capacity planning, set a max limit, on your HPA and whatnot.
Yeah. Sorry.
I actually wanted to ask for some clarification here, which is, are the nodes running out of memory and killing off pods for that reason, or are the individual pods running past their limits and getting killed off? Because those are two different situations.
It looks like the nodes are going out of memory, so we'll see if he can just confirm that. He says that the nodes are running out of memory.
So yeah, so then doing proper capacity planning for, and this isn't something you can necessarily do per node, but you could, unless you strongly use affinities and anti-affinities and whatnot, but you can kind of times it by how many nodes you have in your cluster, and the kube scheduler will do it. The other thing I would say though is you definitely want to design your applications and clusters in a way where you can handle nodes going down. Kubernetes, it's meant to work as one machine, and if one part of that behind the scenes goes down, you might still want to design your application to be highly available. One thing we've done is we'll always make sure, we'll write something for the Kubernetes scheduler to make sure that we at least at a minimum have 2 replicas, one in each AZ, so that if one goes down, so we don't run into the situation where if you have 2 replicas, they're both just happen to be on the same node, and if that node goes down, then you're down. So
I actually have a question on that front. Did you fork and edit the scheduler? How did you customize the scheduler to do that?
you can actually create custom like scheduling policies.
Okay.
I don't know if they're in JSON format or whatnot. It's been a while since I've done it. I'd have to look back. But you are able to create custom schedule policies.
That's very powerful. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. One thing I noticed when I was getting started, I'm still getting started. A lot of the examples you run into don't have memory or CPU limits, and it's like one thing that I learned right away from people who were experts were like set limits for everything so you could do math, right? And then if something can't get scheduled there, you'll get an error as opposed to, oh, like I don't know that this app needs this amount of memory versus this other one, so I'm just gonna start ooming things, right?
Two other things with that that you can do as a cluster admin is you can assign resources at a namespace level, so that even if pods don't assign resources, you're still restricting them at the namespace level. The second thing is this requires 1.9, but earlier I was talking about validating webhook configuration. There's also a mutating webhook configuration, which allows you to actually modify the spec. And so if pods are being deployed and not putting resource limits, you can actually add them for the developers.
And I know there is some work, this is getting a little bit too out of scope, about tying into Prometheus and a bunch of things that can actually monitor your app, and then to let you know that like what you're asking for and what the app is actually using is reasonable, so that it gives you a tool to be able to, you know, make smarter decisions, I guess. We should have him on one time and explain that to us, because it's really great. Okay, any other comments to add before we move on? All right, thanks for that question. If we haven't answered it, please feel free to continue to follow up. We'll move on to the next one here. Nick asks, question regarding Helm. Do you tend to run a single tiller per namespace? Ideally, I want a namespace per team. And with RBAC, I don't really want a team in one namespace to have the ability to deploy another via Helm tiller. Dermijan adds, I use one tiller per cluster. What do y'all think?
So I don't use Helm in production, but the one thing I will say, and this is abstracted from Helm, is you have to decide whether you want to be highly available and highly deployable, or just highly available. If it's a requirement to be highly deployable, you might want to make sure that your tiller deployment is highly available. If it's a requirement to be highly deployable, some people mix up highly available and highly deployable, but they are two different things.
Okay.
Right.
Hey,
Go ahead, George. Sorry.
Can you just define those so that we understand the difference?
Yeah. So highly available means that the runtime traffic to an application is highly available, whereas highly deployable means that it's basically the same thing, but for deployments. At any given time, you're able to deploy. You can handle faults, et cetera. So for example, if you only have maybe one replica of your tiller pod and it goes down, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's in a crashback loop. You're no longer highly deployable at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But your application can still be highly available, because the applications that Helm deployed may be still running.
Yeah, I've heard that referred to as cruise control. When something bad happens, stuff runs, but you can't add stuff. Mario, what do you all do?
Yeah, no, I was just actually going to say, and I just searched it because I've always just run a single tiller instance, and that's by default how it runs. There's an open issue I'm looking at right now, and I will post that in the Slack, of people asking for HA and how your client would handle multiple tillers as well. Obviously, you don't want them stepping on each other, but you again want a probably highly deployable kind of setup for what you're doing, and it depends on how many people you have working and whatnot. I think tiller is deployed as just a basic deployment by default. So I actually do not know much about that. Was there another part to the question, or was it just about tiller or HA?
I think that was it. Sorry, I keep coughing. Let's see if he has any follow-up questions. So scrolling back down, Suresh asks, are KSonnet and Helm complementing each other? So I can actually answer this. I know that Brian Lyles, one of the developers on KSonnet, will be attending the Helm Summit. And now that they've got 2 releases under their belt, they're going to start looking at ways to smartly integrate with Helm. So I cannot answer that question today, but by next month, I can probably answer that. But I guess the best way I can answer that is yes, the Ksana people are talking to Helm people all the time. Let's see what we have next. Still trying to figure out A. Whippler's networking issues. Frank is sharing a few links on Helm permissions. Let's see. If I skip your question, please just repeat it. Wow, everyone is channels hopping today compared to this morning.
Yeah, it's because we're way cooler than those EU folks. I mean,
yes. You just had to make it a competition. I know.
Yeah.
Hey, Whippler asks, in the meantime, is there a document I can read regarding setting up Kubernetes networking services and Ingress CIDRs?
Not sure if there's one place you can go to. So like Ingress CIDRs, are you talking about like the service CIDR range? Like the cluster IP CIDR range? Or the actual like the overlay network CIDR range, like the pod CIDR network? Because like there's one place you can go for that. There's another place you could go to like learn about Kubernetes Ingress resources.
Mm-hmm. It looks like several people are typing furiously. Let's see what Nick has to say here.
Aside from no doubt.
Everybody's typing. Let me just add a comment by Riley Brogan. It says, if I was separating tiller by app team, I'd probably put it in a parallel namespace with RBAC permissions to create objects.
George, I just wanted to tell you have to leave in like 5 minutes to go pick up Rafi.
Oh, okay. Great. So my wife would like to remind everyone that we're running out of time.
Awesome.
Yes.
Okay.
The Google Home is also an intercom.
That's fantastic.
I just found out. If I was separating tiller by app team, I'd probably put it in a parallel namespace with RBAC permissions to create objects in the app team namespace, something like app team-1 tiller and app team-1 app, respectively. Everyone agreeing with that, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can do this. I don't have as much experience with fine-tuning permissions, but there's a lot you can do. I'm actually just about to post. There's actually, so from the client side, it's really about making sure that your Helm binary is talking to the right tiller instance. And you can do that based on what your config is set for your context and namespace currently, but also there's variables that control that, right? So if you have a certain team, you can have them run a certain way and talk to a certain instance in a certain namespace that has certain permissions, etc. So there's a lot you can do there.
Awesome.
And this is very specific to how a company has their CI/CD pipeline configured, and even how they have their namespacing model. So there's a lot of different ways you can configure it based on just those two variables.
And Tim Pepper would like to add, there's network info in the concept and tasks in the top bar nav on kubernetes.io/docs, including some Calico-specific network policy. So you can find those URLs in the channel. Any more questions? We are about 15 minutes from the end here. So we've had some great questions so far. Keep them coming, folks. Let's see.
If people see my head bobbing, it's because I usually pretend like there's death metal playing all the time, even when there isn't. And so I'm actually like drumming with my hands right now as well. So just so if you see, you know, me, I'm not having a seizure. I'm okay. I'm not mad at anyone's questions. I'm good. Everything's fine.
It's like you're the Lobo of the group. We're just metal all the time. Let's see. Looks like people are fiercely typing this. Give them a few minutes. So I think for sure we should definitely invite some Helm/SegApps folks over to one of these sessions. One thing I'd like to mention is that we kind of do these based on user demand. So if people saying, hey, we'd really like to have a Helm one, we could do that. We can definitely do the hard work of chasing down all the developers and getting them for you. It's just a matter of time of grabbing an audience. So if there is interest in this, you can get a hold of me and we can post a list, see if people show up. As long as more than 3 people show up, it's a party, right? Let's see. So it looks like Darmidjan's been using Kubernetes in production for 3 years, and he's totally drank all the Kool-Aid all the way up. So So while we have some time while we're waiting for the next questions, anything interesting or interesting problems that you all have solved recently that you might want to share with the community as far as busted things?
So I have an interesting one that we just figured out. And it escapes me what version of Docker this is. I think it's 112.6, or it may affect multiple ones. But Docker was not properly handling when the container D went down, when the container D process terminated. And so Docker would still be up, but container D process would not be. And so you would get errors like unable to communicate to Docker or whatnot, because Docker wasn't actually handling that gracefully, or maybe it was handling it too gracefully. And so like we solved it by splitting those, or alerting on the container D and restarting it when that process went down. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe CoreOS actually splits the container D process and the Docker process in the system, or into separate things that it manages separately, as opposed to together. But just a random one that I solved over the past couple days.
Yeah, have you investigated cryo at all, since we had someone bring it up earlier?
We are moving to it. We're not on it now. Well, actually, take that back. I think we are using it with Flannel. Actually, I'm pretty sure we're using it with Flannel. The thing we keep going back and forth, right? And this kind of has to do with the whole overlay thing with, containerizing your overlay and whatnot. When you put, when you use cryo for overlay and you start, containerizing all of your overlay components, if something happens with Docker, it can tear down your overlay network, even though it's not necessarily the issue.
Wait, are you mixing up cryo and CNI?
Oh, you know what? Yep, sorry. I thought you said CNI, even though I heard cryo.
No.
Sorry, I will stop. No, we do not use cryo, although we potentially might use it in the future.
Yeah. So for people in the audience who don't what are these 3-letter things that start with C? And it sounds like you're swapping out components. Just give us the quick TLDR.
Yeah. So CNI stands for Container Networking Interface. And so it's the API that allows Kubernetes to communicate with whatever network overlay or mapping. Wait, what is it that Calico calls themselves? Because they're not an overlay. The thing that's not an overlay, but still network.
Yeah. For the Bastion server, I was adding the others.
Oh, Jeff, you have a hot mic?
So whatever networking that you're using for your cluster, overlay or otherwise, goes through the CNI. CSI, which is relatively new, is similar for storage, the container storage interface. CRIO is a project that supplies an alternate container runtime. That is, the container runtime is the piece of software that takes a container image, which is a set of files, and allows you to run it in its own namespace as sort of an active piece of software, a virtual environment. Obviously, the most common and popular one is Docker, which, these days the one we hear about the runtime's container D, right? CoreOS has Rocket, and then Cryo is one that was designed from the ground up to implement. There's an API there, again, another 3-letter API, CRI, which stands for Container Runtime Interface. And Cryo was designed from the ground up to fulfill the CRI API spec and nothing else. The idea is, to only do the things that Kubernetes asks for and not anything else. And some people run that instead of running Containerd. Some people run several different container runtime interfaces. There's also other things that use the CRI, like Kata containers, which are actually little VMs that Kubernetes calls.
Formerly known as clear containers.
Yes.
Yes. I just started playing with those myself, so I'm really excited. I actually have a NUC incoming just for that. I'm going to have a little home lab here. Okay, so TLDR, these things just let you swap out different components, right? So you can have different networking, different storage, different runtimes.
Yeah, it's all about an interface that then uses
Right.
something to do something else,
Yep.
right? And that interface with how Kubernetes and isolating actions. Yeah, exactly. So
Yep.
run C is another popular one as well, which is the default for CRI-O, I believe.
Yep, and Mario pasted in the channel a link to a LWN.net article on demystifying container runtimes. Sorry about the beagles. Let's see. Nick points out to everybody that the new Docker on OS 10 has Kubernetes integration, and actually at tomorrow's Kubernetes community meeting, someone from Docker will be there to demo that. I'm really excited to see that. Moving on to more questions. Nick asks, question, do people tend to deploy clustered databases, Galera, for example, in Kubernetes these days? I remember a few tweets from Kelsey saying to avoid these a long time ago. Stateful sets of volume clean templates seem to enable this, and it works quite nicely. Just not sure if it's common practice in production.
Well, I would say it's not common practice in production yet, simply because if you go back just a year, the tooling inside Kubernetes to support highly stateful applications like databases wasn't really complete. And anybody who's running something in production now is because they were actually trying it out a year ago. So right now what we're seeing is a lot of people running these applications in dev and in test. Because we have both, I mean, two things basically made it worlds easier to run databases under Kubernetes. One is stateful sets, and the second is operators. And more broadly, CRDs, actually. So more acronyms. What does CRD stand for?
Custom resource definition?
Custom resource definition.
Yeah, custom resource definition, which is a way to define your own Kubernetes object at runtime. Without needing to compile any Go on the fly.
Yep.
You have to write some. And then I would say, actually, because I talk about this, is there a breakdown is the value of running databases on Kubernetes depends on your use case. And it's really a question of how valuable is automated deploy of new databases to you, right? To give you two situations, right? You have one small database for each application that you have, and the development teams are in charge of their own databases. In that case, Kubernetes can supply tremendous value to you because they can be in charge of deployment and maintenance of their own databases, not just be responsible for a separate database. On the other hand, many large enterprises have a single gigantic database with 25 terabytes of storage that has everything in it and is managed by a DBA team. That's not going to be a good case for Kubernetes because that database probably not only uses all the resources on the system, but uses all the resources on multiple systems and is managed completely separately from the application workflow. So someday, of course, I want to be able to run all databases no matter how large on Kubernetes. Right now, there's a kind of value proposition depending on
Sure.
the sort of size and centrality.
Yeah, so Riley was adding that Oracle has a MySQL operator that they're supposed to be releasing soon. And 3D Influence says, my coworker gave a talk at KubeCon about the MySQL operator and left a link. Do you mind if I ask it's going to sound like I'm being sarcastic and cynical, but you've been in a database, you've been in databases for a long time. It just feels like one of those things like, is it worth, like it feels like stable technology, why would I try to put it in Kubernetes? Is this the year where we're still figuring that out?
Let me explain this. Right, let me explain this to you.
Sure.
The median size of a PostgreSQL database in the field is about 100 megabytes. For every database that you hear about, because it's like 16 terabytes or whatever, and runs somebody's entire enterprise, etc., there are something on the order of 100,000 databases that are 100 megabytes or less.
Okay.
Those small databases should not have a person managing them. They should be managed by automated systems. And Kubernetes is an excellent automated system for managing resources that have availability requirements.
So for you, it's about easily helping the 90% And the 10% of people with those really high-end systems have the resources to know what they're doing, right? Sounds like what you're getting at.
Right, yeah. It's just, or to put it another way, you don't want to devote a full-time person to managing a database with 150 megabytes of data that supports a single non-critical application. That should be automatic.
Cool.
And doing it the sort of manual way on the base OS, et cetera, it's hard to make it fully automatic. As in, you can make failover automatic, so if you lose one machine, it comes up on the other machine. But then when you want to allocate a new machine, some DBA has to log in and install a database replica in that machine. And Kubernetes can do that for you.
Okay. And then Dermijan adds, we require test validation to spin up an entirely fresh instance of MySQL at specific versions to run migration, seeding, testing, and then they throw it away. So that sounds like a great use case. JJ wants to ask, is this discussion also relevant for distributed NoSQL databases?
And the answer is very much so. Because one of the other things that you look into is if you look into something like Cassandra or Kafka or another database that requires multiple nodes to run, often many nodes, the deployment process of that can be very complicated. One of the various projects I continue to do is CitusDB, which is a distributed SQL database. And one of the big sort of blockers for users installing CitusDB themselves is the installation process of how do I get all of these nodes there, how do I assign them identities, how do I get a network assigned to them, etc. Well, again, Kubernetes can do all that for you.
That is, I hadn't thought about it that way. See, I've been telling people, like usually at local groups, someone's like, "Yeah, I want to stick my databases in Kubernetes," and I'm like, how many hours have you spent in the past decade making your database endpoint like really reliable and stuff? Do you really want to start over?
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of that has changed, right? Because there's a lot of software, right? A lot of the newer databases are designed to be high availability from the get-go. And even old databases like MySQL and Postgres are being retrofitted to support that. And so the only thing that they're missing is an infrastructure like Kubernetes that can, for example, replace nodes that have gone missing.
Right. So it looks like we have time for one more question, and then we're going to have to kill it for the day. As I always recommend having Josh Burkus available at parties for insights like this. This is why you go to OSCON. It's like the only reason. Oh, no, just kidding. It's a very big reason to go to OSCON, is to get this kind of information. Tim Pepper's been taking notes for everyone. Thanks a lot, Tim. Really appreciate that. Let's see. Nick wants to add, it seems operators of the future. There's a nice Redis one as well, which I've been looking at. And then links to that. JJ.
So Josh,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, so maybe you could comment. There was actually a question in the meeting this morning. In your opinion, what's the difference between an operator and a controller? You were mentioning operators earlier, so I'm wondering what your take is on the difference between the two.
I think he's looking for his mute button. Or I think he's back to helping a Whippler with his networking. It sounds like they're making progress, though.
Well, it didn't sound like a question for me. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Last question.
It didn't sound like a question for me, and so I was busy looking up networking stuff for a Whippler. Sorry.
Sorry.
All right, Frank, repeat it real quick, and it'll be our last question.
So I know I had some confusion about this, so I'm sure people in the audience might, but I implement a lot of Kubernetes controllers, and lately the word operator has started to pop up. What do you think the difference between an operator and a controller is?
Operator is a superset of the controller. A lot of operators implement their own controllers. So think of a controller plus its own command set. So often its own cuddle to manage whatever resource it is, and possibly some other Kubernetes resources as well.
So a controller would be the actual logic that does something when a resource is apply to the cluster, whereas the operator is a full maybe application around that, including maybe client APIs for your custom resources and
yes. Yeah. APIs, possibly, you know, a namespace within etcd where you actually store metadata about the things that you're deploying. Because like there's a Postgres controller out there where you actually, we actually modify it by updating a manifest through kube control, and it looks for those manifest items, and then the custom controller that comes with this actually takes that manifest and deploys things according to it. So yeah, so it's a superset that involves a custom controller. And I'm going to need to turn that off because my answering machine just went off.
Yes. I wonder if A. Whippler's just calling you. It's like, hey, I got the network I need. All right, so with that was all the time we had for this week. Thanks everyone who attended. As always, we love feedback. Please just dump it in the channel. Thanks to the following companies for supporting the community office hours with developer volunteers. It's really great that companies allow their engineers work time to do this. So thanks to Amazon, Bitnami, Giant Swarm, Heptio, Liquid Web, Northwestern Mutual, Packet.net, Pivotal, Red Hat, Weaveworks, and VMware for Tim. Thanks for the notes today. Soon we'll be holding raffles, like I said, with t-shirts, the Kubernetes spinners, and all that stuff. So just by coming and participating, you have a chance to win some stuff. And lastly, feel free to hang out in the Office Hours channels afterwards, get to know each other. Looks like people are really excited, and we've had a lot of great... This is the first time where it was difficult for me to keep up with the scrolling. So please help us out by telling a friend. And if you're looking for a friendly home, definitely hang out with us. And we will see everybody the next third Wednesday of the month, which you will find the link always in the channel and hash office hours. I do announce these at the community meeting, and I post them on Kubernetes-users and Kubernetes-novice. And with that, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks again to our panel for hanging out, and we'll see everyone next month.